When Vivian Kingsley ordered Owen Calder pulled off her $99 million jet, the entire hangar went silent. She believed the quiet man in the work jacket was nothing more than a mechanic slowing down her schedule. But 10 minutes later, her chief pilot removed his wings, set them on the table, and refused to fly. Then a second pilot did the same. Then a third. Within the hour, all 12 pilots assigned to her fleet stood on the tarmac in open defiance of the woman who signed their paychecks. Vivian had no idea what Owen Calder had just found buried inside the aircraft's control system, or why his signature alone could decide whether her empire survived the week. Subscribe now, because what happens next inside that hangar will flip every assumption about power, money, and who really controls the sky. The sun had barely cleared the tree line at Teterboro when the Aurelius X-9 rolled out of its private hangar, its fuselage gleaming under floodlights that never seemed to switch off. Vivian Kingsley arrived in a black sedan trailed by 2 assistants, her general counsel, and Derek Vaughn, the man who ran day-to-day operations for her family's aviation holdings. She had less than 3 hours to reach Geneva, where a $6.4 billion acquisition of a Swiss engine manufacturer waited on her signature. The deal was not simply business to her. It was proof, finally, that she could grow the Kingsley name beyond what her late father had built on her own terms and by her own hand. Beneath the aircraft, in the narrow crawl space behind the avionics bay, a man in a faded jacket knelt with a flashlight clenched between his teeth, tracing a wire that should not have existed in that configuration. Vivian noticed him only in passing, assumed he was outside contract labor hired for a routine check, and walked past without a second glance. Owen Calder did not introduce himself, and nobody offered to introduce him for her. He worked in silence, methodical and unbothered by the sedans and security radios humming around him, cross-referencing a serial number stamped into a small power transfer unit against the maintenance log open on his tablet. Around him, the hangar buzzed with the particular energy of a departure that could not slip, catering carts rolling past, a valet idling near the private entrance, an assistant reciting a revised itinerary into her phone as though speaking it aloud might will the schedule back into shape. None of it touched him. He had spent enough years around aircraft to know that urgency and safety rarely arrived in the same room without someone eventually having to choose between them, and he preferred to make that choice early, before anyone was strapped into a seat far above the ground. The numbers did not match. He asked a passing technician about it, and the young man hesitated before admitting that Derek Vaughn had personally requested the aircraft be buttoned up before sunrise, no questions asked. Owen requested 20 additional minutes to complete a deeper inspection, explaining that a transfer switch outside its documented specification could behave unpredictably once the aircraft reached operating altitude. Derek cut him off before Vivian could respond, insisting the issue had already been resolved the previous night by a contracted vendor. Vivian, checking her watch and thinking only of the clock ticking toward Geneva, told Owen he had exactly 20 minutes, and warned that anyone responsible for delaying her flight would never work for Kingsley again. Owen simply nodded, turned back toward the open panel, and noticed a fresh seal pressed over a component that had no business being sealed at all. He had learned, over a long career spent reading electrical systems the way other people read faces, that the ones designed to fail quietly were always more dangerous than the ones that failed loudly. A loud failure announced itself, gave a crew time to react, filled a cockpit with warnings no one could ignore. A quiet failure waited, patient and unremarkable, until the exact moment when patience ran out. He peeled back the cover and found what he had feared, a length of wire spliced into the transfer circuit using a part that did not appear anywhere in the aircraft's original design documentation. It was the kind of shortcut that could pass a visual glance and still fail catastrophically the moment real electrical load hit it. Owen pulled up the maintenance history on his tablet and searched for any authorized work order tied to that component, finding nothing. He questioned 2 more technicians, and their answers contradicted each other in small but telling ways, each one describing a different timeline for when the part had supposedly been installed. One young mechanic, clearly uneasy, admitted that Derek had told the crew to finish the job quietly and not to file the usual paperwork until after the aircraft departed. Owen understood immediately what that meant. Whoever had made this decision was betting that nobody would ask questions until the plane was already in the air. He explained calmly, without raising his voice, that a spliced transfer switch might function perfectly on the ground, drawing minimal power while parked in a controlled hangar environment. At cruising altitude, under full electrical load, that same switch could fail to trigger the backup system exactly when the aircraft needed it most. Derek interrupted, telling Vivian that Owen was inflating a theoretical risk to justify billing more inspection hours, a tactic he claimed independent contractors used all the time. Vivian, under pressure and unwilling to be the reason a 9-figure deal collapsed, asked Owen to simply sign a temporary release so the aircraft could depart, promising the part would be properly replaced once they landed in Geneva. Owen looked at her directly and told her that his signature would not make the airplane any safer, only her schedule more convenient. It was the first time all morning someone had told her no without flinching, and she did not know what to do with that. In front of the ground crew, in front of her own legal counsel, she watched a man in work boots refuse to bend to her timeline, and something in her calm exterior began to crack. Owen placed a red warning tag across the cockpit control panel and formally declared the aircraft unfit to depart until further testing confirmed the backup system would engage properly under load. During a brief pause in the standoff, his phone buzzed with a call from his 17-year-old daughter, Avery, checking whether he would make it home in time for her evening ceremony at school. He told her honestly that he might not, that something at work needed his full attention, and Avery, used to her father's sense of duty, told him she understood and would see him whenever he got there. There was no anger in his voice as he spoke to her, no performance of sacrifice meant to be overheard by anyone standing nearby. It was simply the shape his life had taken since his wife died, a quiet series of trades between the job in front of him and the moments he wished he could keep whole. He had missed evenings before, missed small milestones, missed mornings he could never get back because somewhere a report needed his signature before a deadline that would not wait. Avery had grown up understanding her father in a way most teenagers never had to, not as an absence but as a kind of steadiness that occasionally cost them both something. He set the phone down and returned his focus to the panel, the quiet resolve of a man who had already decided the trade he was willing to make that day. Vivian, watching the exchange from a distance, assumed it was simply proof that this contractor had personal problems distracting him from his job. She had no idea the man in front of her had once spent years designing exactly this kind of backup system, or that he had learned the cost of ignoring warnings the hardest way imaginable. To her, in that moment, he was only an obstacle standing between her and a departure slot she could not afford to lose. Derek leaned toward Vivian and murmured that men like this sometimes carried old grudges against corporate aviation, hinting without evidence that Owen might be manipulating the situation out of resentment rather than genuine concern. Vivian asked for Owen's file, and Derek produced a thin summary describing him only as a temporary contract specialist, omitting nearly everything of substance. She proposed a compromise, a shortened 45-minute load test, instead of the full inspection Owen wanted, but even that felt unbearable against a countdown she measured in minutes rather than hours. Owen offered to run the necessary diagnostics without delaying departure by claiming the tag could be lifted the instant the numbers came back clean, but Derek insisted the tag itself was already costing them the slot. Standing before the assembled ground crew, Vivian declared that hundreds of employees and one crucial deal could not be held hostage by what she called one man's gut feeling. Owen corrected her without heat in his voice, telling her this was not a feeling, it was data pulled directly from the aircraft's own systems. His composure, rather than calming her, only sharpened her frustration, because for the first time that morning, status and urgency were not enough to move someone out of her way. Unable to force compliance through words, Vivian turned to her security detail and ordered them to escort Owen off the aircraft and revoke his access to the hangar entirely. He did not resist, did not raise his voice, and did not argue the point further, aware that a fight in front of cameras and staff would accomplish nothing. Before the guards reached him, he handed his written findings to Graham Locke, the chief pilot standing near the boarding stairs, and told him plainly that the final decision belonged to whoever was going to sit in that cockpit. Vivian watched the exchange without fully registering its weight, certain that removing the obstacle meant the problem itself had been removed along with him. She climbed the boarding stairs believing she had reclaimed control of her morning, her deal, and her schedule in one decisive move. Derek, eager to prove his loyalty, immediately ordered the warning tag stripped from the control panel and instructed the ground crew to finish engine preparation without delay. Nobody in that hangar yet understood that authority and safety were about to become two very different things, or that the gap between them would widen faster than anyone standing on that tarmac could have predicted. Vivian settled into the cabin, accepted a glass of water from a flight attendant who had learned long ago not to ask questions about the tension trailing behind her employer, and opened her laptop to review the final terms of the acquisition. For a few brief minutes, she allowed herself to believe the morning's disruption had simply been an inconvenience now safely behind her, the kind of small friction that came standard with running an operation this large. Outside, on the tarmac, that belief was already beginning to unravel in ways she could not yet see from her window. Graham Locke stood at the base of the boarding stairs long after Vivian disappeared into the cabin, the folded report from Owen still gripped in one hand. A career Air Force veteran with more than 18,000 flight hours behind him, Graham had learned decades earlier that composure mattered more than confidence when something did not sit right. He unfolded the pages and began reading line by line, recognizing the exact subsystem Owen was describing because he had once trained under him years earlier during an experimental flight test program. Graham asked Derek directly for the installation certificate tied to the replacement part, a routine request that should have taken 30 seconds to satisfy. Derek could not produce it, offering only a verbal assurance that senior management had already approved the change through channels Graham was not privy to. That answer, vague and unsupported, was enough for Graham to make his decision without further hesitation. He climbed the stairs, informed Vivian that he would not be flying the aircraft until Owen completed his inspection, and calmly stepped back down onto the tarmac. Vivian assumed Graham's refusal stemmed from personal loyalty rather than professional judgment, and she immediately called for the fleet's backup pilot to take his place. That pilot read the same report, checked the same maintenance logs, and reached the identical conclusion within minutes, declining to fly for the same documented reasons. Derek, growing visibly rattled, began contacting every remaining pilot on the Kingsley roster, confident that someone among the 12 would be willing to take the controls without complaint. One by one, they arrived at the hangar, reviewed the findings, and invoked their contractual right to refuse a flight when an unresolved maintenance discrepancy existed. None of them acted out of blind allegiance to Owen or any personal history with him. They refused because none of them were willing to gamble their licenses, their careers, or the lives of everyone aboard on a component with no verifiable paperwork behind it. Vivian, desperate and increasingly aware of how quickly her authority was slipping, offered triple compensation to any pilot willing to take the aircraft up regardless of the tag. That offer, rather than motivating anyone, was the moment Graham quietly set his wings on the table in front of her, a gesture that made clear this had stopped being purely a technical dispute. It had become a question of what kind of leadership she was asking her people to trust. One after another, the remaining pilots followed his lead, removing their own credentials from their jackets and setting them beside his without a word of protest or theater. 12 professionals, each with years of training and reputations built on discipline, stood in a loose line along the hangar wall, having made their decision independently and unanimously. The aircraft sat fully fueled, doors sealed, ready in every visible way to depart, and yet it was going nowhere. Derek stared at the row of idle pilots, unable to process how quickly his plan had unraveled in under an hour. Vivian stood at the top of the boarding stairs, looking down at an empty cockpit and a united front of professionals who had chosen collective judgment over a paycheck. The message from the tarmac was unmistakable. This aircraft would not leave the ground until the man they had just thrown off it put his signature on paper confirming it was safe. Word of the standoff moved through the company faster than any memo could have carried it, technicians pausing their work on other aircraft to glance toward the hangar, assistants whispering into phones that something unusual was unfolding on the tarmac. It was not the kind of story anyone needed to exaggerate. 12 pilots, each one with a career and a license on the line, had made the same decision independently, without coordinating, without a single raised voice among them. That kind of unity was rare in any workplace, and rarer still in an industry where competition for flight hours could easily have pushed at least one of them toward compliance. Instead, the hangar held a silence that felt less like defiance and more like consensus. The quiet agreement of people who had simply refused to pretend a problem did not exist. Furious and out of options, Vivian demanded that all 12 pilots be terminated on the spot, but her general counsel, Maren Ellis, intervened before the order could be carried out. Maren warned that mass termination over a documented safety refusal could expose the company to serious regulatory liability, particularly if any of it reached federal aviation investigators. Graham handed her Owen's complete professional file, the one Derek had conveniently failed to mention earlier that morning, and Vivian finally read what she had dismissed as irrelevant paperwork. Owen Calder had once served as lead systems engineer on the very program that developed the Aurelius X-9's backup transfer architecture, one of only 3 people who had authored its original certification standards. He had also been the specific inspector, assigned by the company's own insurance underwriter after 3 unexplained electrical warnings had appeared on this exact aircraft over recent weeks. The board of directors, not Derek's operations division, had quietly retained Owen because they suspected something irregular was happening inside the maintenance chain. Vivian understood, with a cold and sudden clarity, that she had not simply inconvenienced a contractor that morning. She had removed from the aircraft the one person on site with both the authority and the expertise to determine whether it was genuinely safe to fly. She read further and found a note from a board member describing Owen not as a vendor but as an insurance requirement, a name attached to the policy itself. Someone whose sign-off was not optional paperwork but a condition of coverage for the entire fleet. The realization landed with a different kind of weight than embarrassment. It was the sudden understanding that the morning's chaos had never truly been about a stubborn contractor slowing down her schedule, but about a structural safeguard she had personally dismantled without knowing what it protected. She set the file down on the desk, aware for the first time that day that her instincts, so reliable in boardrooms and negotiations, had failed her completely in a hangar full of grease and wiring diagrams. By the time she reached the parking area to find him, Owen was already loading his tools into his truck, prepared to leave the airport entirely. Marin caught up first, asking him to return and finish what he had started, but Owen made it clear this was no longer something a simple apology could fix. He told her plainly that if Vivienne still believed a business deadline outweighed a documented safety standard, his signature would only enable her to repeat the same mistake somewhere down the line. In a rare moment of candor, Owen mentioned that his wife had died 8 years earlier after a manager pressured a flight crew into accepting a defect that everyone at the time called purely theoretical. He offered no further details, only that it had taken him nearly a decade to understand that silence from experts could be just as dangerous as the mechanical failure itself. Marin, absorbing the weight of what he had just shared, told him that the same suspect component now installed on the X9 appeared, according to fragmented records she had just pulled, in the maintenance history of 3 other aircraft in the Kingsley fleet. Owen closed his eyes for a moment, the tools in his hand suddenly feeling heavier than they had all morning. He had come to Teterboro expecting a single flawed part on a single aircraft, an isolated oversight he could correct and document before moving on to the next assignment on his calendar. What Marin had just described was something else entirely, a pattern stretching across an entire fleet, the kind of systemic shortcut that rarely happened by accident and almost never happened without someone deciding, somewhere along the way, that speed mattered more than certainty. That single sentence transformed the crisis from one delayed flight into a fleet-wide emergency threatening every aircraft under the Kingsley name. The board convened an emergency call within the hour, and the room split immediately between those demanding Vivienne push the aircraft into the air regardless of the warning, and those terrified the insurer would cancel coverage entirely if falsified records surfaced. Derek denied any wrongdoing outright, attempting to shift blame onto an outside technical contractor he claimed had misled him about the part's certification. Owen agreed to return under 3 conditions, refusing to negotiate any further compromise. No pilot would face pressure or retaliation for declining to fly. Every maintenance record across all 4 aircraft would be opened for full review without restriction, and the entire diagnostic test would be recorded and transmitted directly to the board rather than filtered through operations. Vivienne, standing in front of the same staff who had just watched her eject him from the property, had no real choice but to agree publicly to every term. There was a particular kind of humility required to stand in front of people she had commanded only hours earlier and accept conditions dictated by someone she had ordered removed from the premises. She did not enjoy it, and nothing about her posture suggested comfort, but she nodded once, firmly, and told the room the terms would stand exactly as Owen had laid them out. Graham watched the exchange from across the hangar, arms crossed, saying nothing, though something in his expression suggested this was the first moment. All day, he had seen her make a decision he actually respected. Owen did not gloat or make a show of his return. He organized the technical team immediately, assigning tasks with the same calm precision he had shown hours earlier, and began systematically tracing every circuit connected to the transfer switch across all 4 aircraft. His professionalism stood in sharp contrast to Derek, who paced the hangar floor issuing contradictory instructions and growing more erratic as the review progressed. Vivienne watched him address each technician by name, explain the reasoning behind every step rather than barking commands, and consistently declined to blame junior staff for decisions made far above their authority. A brief call from Avery interrupted the work, the teenager asking again whether her father would make it home for her ceremony that evening. Owen told her honestly that he likely would not, and Avery, without complaint, told him she understood exactly why he had to stay. Vivian overheard enough of the exchange to recognize that Owen was paying a real personal cost for a decision she had tried to override with money and authority hours earlier, and the realization unsettled her more than she expected. Deep in the aircraft's electrical logs, Owen discovered something even more damning than the mismatched part itself. 3 separate automated warnings had been generated by the system over the previous 2 weeks, each one flagging irregular voltage behavior in the same transfer circuit, and each one had been manually cleared before reaching the standard maintenance queue. He traced the deletion history back to its source, expecting to find an outside vendor or a rushed junior technician covering a mistake. Instead, the access credentials used to erase all 3 warnings belonged to a single executive-level account, one authorized only for senior operations leadership within the company. Owen stared at the screen for a long moment before printing the log and setting it aside for Marin to review. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate, to be an accident or an oversight buried in routine paperwork. 3 warnings, 3 deletions, each one timed within hours of the alert first appearing, as though someone had been actively monitoring the system for exactly this kind of signal and moving quickly to erase it before anyone else noticed. That was not the behavior of a careless employee cutting corners under pressure. It was the behavior of someone who understood precisely what those warnings meant and had made a calculated decision that the risk was worth taking rather than the delay. When Marin finally saw the name attached to that account, there was no longer any ambiguity about who had been hiding the truth from everyone on that tarmac. The account belonged to Derek Vaughn, and the timeline made it impossible to argue coincidence. Cornered by the evidence, Derek shifted tactics entirely, producing old records showing that Owen's previous engineering firm had collapsed years earlier following a certification dispute with a major manufacturer. He suggested, without stating it outright, that Owen was using this crisis to settle old scores against an industry that had once pushed him out. A few board members, already anxious about the deal collapsing, began quietly questioning whether Owen's motives could be trusted. Owen did not deny any of it. He confirmed that his firm had indeed failed, and explained that it happened because he refused to certify an aircraft model that had not passed the required safety trials, a decision that cost him nearly everything he owned at the time. Major clients withdrew their contracts. Most of his staff left for competitors, and within 18 months the company he had spent a decade building no longer existed. He did not share the story looking for sympathy, only stating flatly that given the same choice again, he would refuse to sign exactly the same way. A few members of the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unused to hearing someone speak so plainly about losing everything and still describing the outcome as the correct one. Owen added, almost as an afterthought, that the model he had refused to certify all those years ago was eventually pulled from production after a separate unrelated incident proved his original concerns had been correct. He did not say it to win the argument. He said it because it was simply true, and because he had long ago stopped measuring his decisions by whether they were popular in the moment they were made. Marin continued working through the email trail late into the afternoon and eventually found the message that made Derek's culpability undeniable. Months earlier, the original part manufacturer had explicitly warned Kingsley's operations division that the replacement transfer unit was not certified for use on the Aurelius X9 platform under any circumstances. Derek had received that warning directly and approved the installation anyway, reasoning internally that the properly certified part required a 7-day shipping delay he was unwilling to accept. He argued, almost desperately, that Vivian's own culture of demanding every aircraft remain perpetually available had left him no room to say no to a shortcut. It was an uncomfortable point, and one that landed harder on Vivian than she wanted to admit in front of her own board. She could continue treating Derek as a lone bad actor operating outside her knowledge, or she could confront the possibility that her leadership style had quietly taught her staff to hide problems rather than report them. Derek, sensing the walls closing in, proposed one final option, suggesting Vivian quietly board a different aircraft, keep the incident contained, and finish the Geneva deal before any of this became public. Owen interrupted before she could respond, reminding everyone in the room that if this component had failed on one aircraft, there was no reason to assume the other 3 fleet jets were any safer. He asked the room a simple question that nobody immediately answered. If the plan was to quietly fly Vivian out on a different jet while this one stayed grounded, who exactly had verified that the substitute aircraft was not carrying the identical defect? The silence that followed was answer enough. Derek's face tightened, aware that his proposed solution had just been exposed as no solution at all, only a slightly different version of the same gamble dressed up as a compromise. Rather than accept Derek's proposal to bury the problem and fly anyway, Vivian authorized a full diagnostic load test to be conducted immediately, right there in the hangar, without the aircraft ever leaving the ground. Owen connected specialized equipment designed to simulate the exact electrical demands the aircraft would experience at cruising altitude near 30,000 feet. Derek argued loudly that the test had been designed from the outset to produce a failure, a claim nobody in the room took seriously given the documentation already on record. The entire procedure was streamed live to the board, to the company's insurance underwriter, and to every one of the 12 pilots still waiting outside the aircraft. For the first several minutes, every reading came back within normal parameters, and a few skeptical voices in the room began to wonder aloud whether Owen had overstated the danger after all. Vivian felt the tension in her chest tighten with every passing second, aware that each minute lost to this test brought her closer to losing the Geneva negotiation entirely. Then, as the simulated load increased toward the emergency threshold, the spliced transfer switch responded noticeably slower than its rated specification required. Owen ordered the primary power source shut down to observe whether the backup system would engage as designed, and for several agonizing seconds, it did not. 3 cockpit displays went dark simultaneously before the secondary power finally caught and restored them, a delay that would translate, at real altitude, into several critical seconds of lost flight data during precisely the moment a crew would need it most. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse, only darkened screens and a low emergency tone in an otherwise silent hangar, yet the silence afterward said everything that needed to be said. Graham stepped forward and confirmed, without a hint of satisfaction in his voice, that he and the other 11 pilots had been correct to refuse the flight that morning. Owen pointed to a secondary reading showing the faulty component had also been running at an elevated temperature, evidence that the risk would only compound over the length of a longer international flight. Vivienne stared at the seat she would have been sitting in only hours earlier, and the full weight of what nearly happened settled over her in a way no report or argument had managed to convey. Owen had not sabotaged her flight or her deal that morning. He had quietly prevented her from becoming the reason an aircraft full of people never made it to Geneva at all. For a long moment, nobody in the hangar spoke, the low hum of the diagnostic equipment powering down the only sound left in the room. Vivian thought about every deadline she had ever treated as more urgent than a warning light, every meeting where she had asked a team to move faster without asking what moving faster might cost. None of those moments had ever produced a result as stark as 3 dark cockpit screens and a room full of people who understood exactly how close they had come to something no apology could have fixed. Within the hour, the fleet's insurance underwriter issued a formal notice suspending coverage on all 4 Kingsley aircraft, pending the outcome of a full investigation into the falsified maintenance records. The board pressed Vivienne hard to keep the incident contained, arguing that any public disclosure would collapse both the stock price and the pending acquisition in a single news cycle. She received a call from her counterpart in Geneva shortly after, informing her that either she appeared in person to finalize the agreement or the exclusive negotiating window would expire and reopen to a competing bidder. A commercial flight could theoretically get her there hours late, but nothing could realistically make the original deadline now that the entire fleet sat grounded. Standing in that hangar, Vivienne faced a decision that would define exactly what kind of leader she intended to become going forward. She could protect the deal by staying silent about what had nearly happened, or she could protect the standard that had just saved every person who would have boarded that aircraft. Rather than retreat to her office to decide privately, she called every remaining employee in the hangar together and spoke to them directly, without a prepared statement or legal script standing between her and the truth. In front of Owen, in front of all 12 pilots, and in front of the technicians who had spent the entire day quietly fixing what leadership had allowed to break, Vivienne admitted that her own demands for constant availability had created an environment where people were afraid to report problems honestly. She suspended Derek Vaughan effective immediately, turned every falsified record over to an independent investigator, and formally abandoned any further attempt to force a departure that day. She called her contact in Geneva a second time and told him plainly that she would not be arriving on schedule because her company had just uncovered a serious internal safety failure that needed to be addressed first. She offered no spin, no manufactured excuse, and no attempt to shift blame onto a vendor or a junior employee somewhere down the chain. To nearly everyone's surprise, the Geneva team extended the exclusive negotiating window by 48 hours, explaining afterward that they were selling an engine manufacturer and had little interest in partnering with a company unwilling to stop and fix a dangerous problem when it mattered most. It was not a miracle so much as a signal, one that told the other side exactly how this company would behave the next time something went wrong under real pressure. Her counterpart admitted, almost offhandedly, that he had once watched a partner company hide a similar problem years earlier, a decision that eventually cost that company both the deal and a portion of its reputation it never fully recovered. He said he would rather sign with someone who stopped a plane than someone who would have let it fly. Vivienne thanked him, ended the call, and sat alone for a moment in the quiet of her office, absorbing the strange fact that honesty, the thing she had feared would end the negotiation, had somehow strengthened it instead. Owen still refused to sign off on the aircraft, because the truth remained unchanged regardless of who had just told it publicly. The plane itself was still not repaired. Vivienne approached him directly once the hangar had mostly emptied for the evening, offering an apology that carried no request for forgiveness and no attempt to smooth things over with money or a title. Owen listened without interrupting, then told her honestly that an apology only meant something if the company still protected the next person willing to say no under far less public circumstances than these. The corrected transfer unit, properly certified and shipped overnight from the manufacturer, arrived at the hangar early the following morning. Owen supervised the installation but deliberately stepped back and let the Kingsley technical staff perform the replacement themselves, understanding that they needed to reclaim some measure of professional pride after a day defined by someone else's failure. All 4 aircraft in the fleet were inspected before any of them returned to active service, and while only the X-9 had shown active signs of failure, 2 additional jets carrying the same suspect part were corrected before ever leaving the ground again. Derek Vaughan was formally terminated once the investigation confirmed he had falsified installation records and deliberately deleted 3 system warnings to avoid delaying flight schedules. The junior technicians who had been pressured into silence under his direction were protected rather than punished, a decision Vivienne made publicly and without hesitation. In the weeks that followed, Vivienne restructured the company's internal safety authority so that engineers and pilots could ground any aircraft independently, without first seeking approval from the operations or business development divisions. Graham and the 11 other pilots returned to full flight status once the new safety protocols were formally signed into company policy, none of them having faced any retaliation for their refusal that morning. Owen completed his full certification of the Aurelius X9, but declined the enormous personal bonus the board had approved for his work, requesting instead that the funds establish a training program for technicians willing to report safety violations without fear of losing their jobs. Vivienne offered him a permanent position as the company's independent director of safety, and Owen did not accept immediately, wary of becoming little more than a symbolic figurehead for a rebuilt public image. She proposed instead that the role carry full operational independence, reporting directly to the board rather than through any single executive, including herself. After several days of consideration, Owen agreed to the position on a 6-month trial basis, keeping his options open while the company proved its new standards were more than words on a policy document. The relationship between them settled into something built entirely on professional respect, without any sudden turn toward romance to soften or simplify what had actually happened between them. Vivienne came to rely on Owen not for validation but for the discomfort he was willing to sit with, the questions he asked in meetings that nobody else dared to raise. He, in turn, found something he had not expected to find inside a company as large and image-conscious as Kingsley, a leader genuinely willing to be told she was wrong and to change course because of it. Neither of them mistook that respect for friendship in the traditional sense, and neither felt the need to. It was enough that the aircraft stayed grounded when something was wrong, and that the people responsible for saying so no longer had to fear what saying it might cost them. 3 months later, the acquisition in Geneva closed under significantly stricter safety provisions than the original agreement had contained, provisions both companies agreed strengthened rather than weakened the partnership. Kingsley Aerospace did not collapse under the weight of its own disclosure, and in an unexpected turn, its reputation across the industry improved precisely because it had chosen transparency over concealment when the stakes were highest. Owen continued driving the same aging truck he had always owned, spending as much time as possible outside of work with Avery, who was now preparing for her final year of school. He never became a hidden billionaire or the secret owner of a private jet fleet, and his value to the people around him had never depended on those things in the first place. Vivienne changed the way she ran meetings, making a habit of asking who in the room disagreed with her before allowing anyone to simply confirm a decision she had already made. Before her next international trip, she found Owen at the hangar going over the X9's final pre-flight checklist, and she joked quietly that this time she had no intention of throwing him off the aircraft. Owen replied, without missing a beat, that this time he had no reason to keep her from boarding it either. Graham confirmed over the radio that the aircraft was fully certified and ready, and one by one, all 12 pilots resumed their positions across the fleet, not because Vivienne had reclaimed the authority to command them, but because she had finally earned their trust back. As the Aurelius X9 lifted cleanly off the runway into the pale early light, Owen stood on the tarmac watching it climb, a message from Avery, lighting up his phone to say simply that she was proud of him. Through the small cabin window, Vivienne looked down at the hangar shrinking beneath her and understood, perhaps for the first time with total clarity, that the man she had once dismissed as an obstacle standing in her way had actually been the one thing standing between her company and its own quiet destruction. The engines settled into a steady, even hum as the aircraft leveled off above the clouds, carrying a leadership that had finally learned the difference between moving fast and moving safely. Below, the hangar returned to its usual rhythm, technicians checking the next aircraft on the schedule, pilots reviewing logs with the same rigor that had once cost them their jobs and ultimately saved everyone involved. Nothing about the morning had unfolded the way Vivienne originally planned it, and in the end, that was exactly why it worked. She had come to the hangar expecting to command a schedule, a deal, and a fleet of aircraft into obeying her will, and she had left instead, having learned the one lesson no amount of money could have taught her on its own. Authority could order a plane to move. It could not order a wire to hold, a switch to fire, or a crew to trust a decision they had not verified themselves. Somewhere over the ocean, 30,000 feet above the water, 12 pilots and 1 grounded engineer had already proven that the only kind of power worth keeping was the kind people chose to follow, not the kind they were simply told to obey.
I just still don't know where to go. Just go straight down to a little hole in the front of the 2 rocks. Am I going the right way right now? This way or no? No, I'm going the wrong way. Okay. What's up, Louis? How you doing today? So I'm going back this way. All those snake guys. Alright. Let's go back around. Thank you for the help. You know I need it. I definitely need the help. Alright. There's no water. Take a left when you reach there. What's up, Trench? How you doing?